that process, kind of helping us answer those questions, is going to start. Okay, handle that part.
I'm gonna make it brand.
Yeah. You got cigarettes with you? You got cigarettes with you? Okay. Did she have something to smoke?
Not
I'll try
today.
to find a cigarette.
Fine, let me lose control over this today.
Just stay here.
He was 4 months old. 4 months. He had not yet learned to sit up on his own. He had not yet tasted solid food. He had not yet said his first word or taken his first step. He had not yet experienced a single season change. He had not yet felt the warmth of a summer sun or seen snow fall for the very first time. Carson Bonito had barely begun, and yet on a quiet night in Fostoria, Ohio, someone made a choice. A choice that ended everything for a baby boy who had done nothing wrong except trust the person who was supposed to protect him most. This is not a story about a monster who came from nowhere. This is a story about a young father, a 25-year-old man named Joseph Bonito, who called 911 and told police his infant son had suddenly stopped breathing, who stood in the doorway of his home and watched paramedics rush inside, who answered questions calmly, who seemed to anyone watching like a father in crisis. But detectives in Fostoria had seen this kind of calm before. And the more they looked, the more they found. Because Carson's tiny body told a story that his father's words never could. This is that story. Every tragedy starts with an ordinary day. Fostoria is a small city in Seneca County, Ohio, population just over 13,000. The kind of place where neighbors know each other's names, where kids ride bikes in the street and front porches still get used in the evenings. Quiet, steady, the kind of town where nothing unusual is supposed to happen. Joseph Bonito was 25 years old. He lived with his partner and their 2 children, a 1-year-old and a 4-month-old infant named Carson. By all outward appearances, they were a young family doing their best. Joseph had the normal responsibilities of a young father: work, fatigue, the relentless grind of raising small children on not enough sleep. Carson was his youngest, 4 months old, still completely dependent on the adults around him for everything: warmth, food, comfort, safety. On the night in question, Joseph was home with the children. His partner was not there. This detail matters, because what happened next happened in a house where Joseph was the only adult, where there were no other witnesses, where the only version of events that night would come from the man who made the 911 call. And that call came in. Emergency dispatchers in Fostoria received a call from Joseph Bonito reporting that his infant son was unresponsive. He said Carson had stopped breathing. He said he did not know what happened. He said he needed help immediately. Paramedics and police responded within minutes. They arrived to find Carson Bonito, 4 months old, barely 15 pounds, in a condition that required immediate emergency intervention. Paramedics worked on the baby. They stabilized him enough to transport. Carson was rushed to the hospital. He never came home. Across the city, detectives were already being briefed. A baby in critical condition, a father's 911 call, an explanation that at this point, nobody had any reason to question. Not yet, but that was about to change. Because Carson arrived at the hospital and the doctors began their examination. And what they found inside that tiny body would set off a chain of events that would take Joseph Bonito from the role of grieving father to defendant in a criminal courtroom. The night was not over, and neither was the investigation. There is always a moment, a single point in time where a different choice could have changed everything, where the door was still open, where the story did not have to end the way it did. For Carson Bonito, that moment came before the 911 call, before the paramedics arrived. In the quiet hours when Joseph Bonito was alone in that house with 2 small children, and something happened that he would spend the next several hours trying to explain away. When investigators first spoke to Joseph that night, his account was straightforward. He said Carson had been acting normally. He said the baby had not been showing any signs of distress. He said he had put Carson down, and when he checked on him later, the baby was unresponsive. It was sudden, he said. It came out of nowhere. It was the story of a horrified parent who had no idea what went wrong. Detectives listened. They took notes. And then they started asking questions. Because in cases involving infants, cases where the child cannot speak, cannot describe what happened, cannot point to anyone or anything, investigators are trained to look very carefully at the timeline, at the sequence of events as told by the adults in the room, at the spaces between what someone says and what the evidence shows. Joseph's timeline had spaces, not obvious ones, not the kind that scream guilt immediately, but small inconsistencies. Moments where the sequence of events did not quite line up, where a text message was sent at a time that did not match the story he was telling, where he claimed to have checked on Carson at a certain point, but the details suggested otherwise. These were the cracks, small fractures in an account that on the surface sounded like a tragedy. But detectives, in cases like this, are not looking at the surface. They are looking at what lies beneath it. And beneath Joseph Bonito's calm exterior, beneath the grieving father act, something else was beginning to show through. The investigation was moving in a direction Joseph had not planned for. And the next conversation was going to be very different from the first. Carson Bonito died at the hospital. He was 4 months old and he was gone. When a child dies under circumstances that are not immediately explained, a medical examiner gets involved. Physicians conduct a thorough examination. Every injury, every mark, every anomaly inside and outside that child's body is documented. Because the body tells the truth, even when the people in the room do not. What the doctors found in Carson's case was devastating. Carson had a pneumothorax, a collapsed lung. This is a condition where air escapes from the lung and fills the space around it, compressing the lung and making it impossible to breathe properly. In adults, this condition can result from trauma or certain medical events. In a 4-month-old infant, it does not happen by accident. That was the first finding. The second was worse. Carson had rib fractures, not fresh ones, rib fractures that were in various stages of healing. This is a critical distinction in child abuse investigations. Old healing rib fractures in an infant tell investigators something specific. They tell investigators that this child experienced trauma not once, but on more than one occasion. That the injuries they are seeing were not the result of a single terrible moment, but of a pattern. A pattern of force applied to a baby who could not run, could not call for help, could not do anything except endure what was being done to him. Investigators also learned something important about what could not have caused these injuries. CPR was performed on Carson that night. Joseph would later attempt to suggest that some of the injuries might be the result of those resuscitation efforts. Medical experts shut that down immediately. The healing rib fractures predated that night by weeks. The pneumothorax was not consistent with the standard application of CPR on an infant. These were not the injuries of an emergency intervention. These were the injuries of violence, done to a child who weighed less than 15 pounds, done by someone who had repeated access to that child. The detectives now had something that Joseph Bonito's careful story could not account for. They had the truth, and it was time to sit across the table from Joseph and find out how long it would take to get it out of him. While Carson was still at the hospital fighting for his life, detectives began working the case. The first person they spoke with was Carson's mother, Joseph's partner. She came in visibly distressed, consumed by the kind of grief that no parent should ever have to carry. Investigators spoke with her carefully, gently, because she was not a suspect. She was a mother in the worst moment of her life. What she told them was consistent with what Joseph had been saying. She described Joseph as a good father, attentive, involved. She said she trusted him with the children. She said he was not a violent person. She said she could not imagine him hurting Carson. She also mentioned something about small bruises she had noticed on Carson's body, but in her mind, those had a simple explanation. The couple's older child, just 1 year old, sometimes played near the baby. She thought perhaps the toddler had caused the marks accidentally, the way young children do when they do not yet understand their own strength or the fragility of an infant. It was the kind of explanation that makes sense on the surface, the kind of explanation you want to believe because the alternative is unbearable. But investigators had already heard from the doctors. They already knew what those bruises were and what they were not. After speaking with Carson's mother, attention turned fully to Joseph. He had been cooperative. He had answered questions. He had presented himself as a man in shock, a father devastated by what had happened to his son. Detectives noted his demeanor. In the hours between the 911 call and this moment, Joseph Bonito had sent text messages to his partner. Those messages were now in the hands of investigators, and the timing of those messages, combined with the timeline Joseph had laid out in his story, raised immediate flags. The messages suggested Joseph had been in contact with his partner at times that did not match when he claimed to have been checking on Carson. There were gaps, unexplained minutes where, according to his own account, he should have been responding to his son, but the phone records told a different story. These were the details that transform a story from plausible to impossible. And now it was time to put Joseph in a room and press on those details. The interrogation was about to begin, and it would not be short. The room is always the same, small, institutional. A table, a few chairs, a camera mounted on the wall, no windows, controlled lighting, a space designed to strip away distraction and force a conversation down to its essential elements. Truth versus the story someone has been telling. Joseph Bonito was brought in for a formal interview. Detectives sat across from him. The recording equipment was running. At this point, Joseph did not yet know the full scope of what the doctors had found. He did not know exactly what the investigators knew. He was still operating under the assumption that his original story, sudden, unexplained infant collapse, was holding together. It was not holding together. The detectives began with a familiar approach. They let Joseph talk. They asked open-ended questions. They allowed him to lay out his version of events once more in his own words, with his own details. Because when a person has been lying and they are asked to repeat that lie under pressure, they fill in the blanks. They add small details. They adjust the story, and those adjustments become evidence. Joseph told his story again. Carson had been fine. There were no warning signs. He put the baby down. He checked on him later. Something had gone wrong that he could not explain. The detectives listened, and then they started pushing back. They asked about the text messages. They asked about the timeline. They showed Joseph the inconsistencies in his own account, the moments that did not line up the gaps in his story that he had not been careful enough to fill in. Joseph shifted in his chair. The calm began to slip. And then the detectives told him what the doctors had found. The rib fractures, the collapsed lung, the evidence of injuries that predated that night by weeks. The medical determination that these injuries could not have been caused by CPR or by a 1-year-old child playing near the baby. They watched his face as they laid it all out. Joseph Bonito's story was falling apart in real time. And in that room under those fluorescent lights with that camera running, he had a choice to make. He could keep lying, or he could start telling the truth. He chose a middle path, the path that so many people in that chair choose. He began to give partial truths, small admissions wrapped in justifications, pieces of the real story, but not all of it. Not yet. But the room had more time, and the detectives had more questions. And the camera was still running. Admissions come in layers. Rarely does a person sit in an interrogation room and immediately tell the whole truth. The process is slow. It is a negotiation not of terms, but of how much reality a person is willing to accept and acknowledge out loud. Joseph Bonito began with denial. He had not hurt Carson. He did not know where the injuries came from. He was a good father. He loved his children. This was a terrible accident, and he was as confused as anyone. The detectives were patient. They came back to this timeline. They came back to the text messages. They came back to the medical evidence that left no room for coincidence. And Joseph began to move. He admitted that there had been difficult moments, when he had been exhausted. Sleep deprivation is a well-documented reality for parents of newborns. Carson would have been waking multiple times throughout the night. Joseph was working. He was tired. There were moments, he said, when he had perhaps handled the baby a little roughly, not with intent, not to harm, but with less gentleness than he should have used. He said he had picked Carson up in a way that was a little too rough. He acknowledged that his patience had worn thin on occasion. But even in his admissions, he framed everything as accidents, as lapses, as the kind of mistakes an overwhelmed young father makes without thinking, without meaning to cause harm. And then came the most significant admission. A prior police report documentation that investigators had obtained showed that Joseph Bonito had at some point acknowledged shaking Carson, shaking an infant, a 4-month-old baby. This is not a gray area. Shaking an infant is one of the most dangerous things a person can do to a child. The brain of an infant is not fully developed. The neck muscles are not strong enough to support the head during violent motion. When an infant is shaken, the brain moves inside the skull. Blood vessels tear. Brain tissue is damaged. The effects can be catastrophic. They can be fatal. This is not information that requires medical training to understand. This is information that parents are explicitly given in hospitals when their children are born. The dangers of shaking a baby, the absolute prohibition against it. Joseph knew this, and yet, the admissions were enough, combined with the medical evidence, combined with the timeline inconsistencies, combined with everything else the investigators had built over the course of that long, terrible night. But Joseph was still hedging, still softening, still trying to find the version of this story where he was not fully responsible for what had happened to his son. The detectives were not done. There was still more of the investigation to work through, and the evidence was only getting stronger. Criminal investigations involving infant victims are among the most complex and painstaking that law enforcement handles. The victim cannot speak. There are rarely direct witnesses. The physical evidence must do the work that testimony cannot. And every piece of that evidence must be documented, verified, and connected to a specific cause in a specific person. In the Carson Bonito case, investigators worked methodically. The text messages between Joseph and his partner were analyzed in detail. Timestamps were compared against the timeline Joseph had described. The gaps that had first caught investigators' attention became clearer and more significant the more closely they examined the data. There were moments in that night that Joseph had not accounted for. Stretches of time where, according to his own story, Carson should have been fine, but where the medical timeline suggested otherwise. The forensic medical analysis was central to everything. The healing rib fractures were particularly important. Forensic pathologists can examine a fracture and determine within a range how old it is. The fractures found in Carson's body were not from that night. They were from a prior incident days or weeks earlier. This meant that Carson had been injured before. It meant that whatever had been done to him had been done more than once. And it meant that the adults around him, at least one of them, had known this child was hurt and had not sought medical help. The pneumothorax, the collapsed lung, was consistent with blunt force trauma to the chest, the kind of force that might accompany shaking combined with impact, or sustained forceful compression. Applied to a 4-month-old baby, investigators also worked to establish a clearer picture of the household. They looked at who had access to Carson. They looked at the history of the family. They looked at whether there had been any prior concerns, any prior reports, anything in the record that should have raised a flag. The case was being built piece by piece. Every piece pointed in the same direction. Joseph Bonito's partial admissions combined with the physical evidence, combined with the timeline contradictions, were enough for investigators to move forward. An arrest was made. Joseph Bonito was taken into custody and charged with aggravated murder, the most serious charge that can be brought in the death of a child in Ohio. He was also charged with endangering children. The man who had called 911, the man who had stood in the doorway and watched the paramedics work, the man who had sat across the table from detectives and slowly, reluctantly peeled away the layers of his own deception. He was now facing the rest of his life behind bars. And the courtroom was waiting. The case moved through the legal system the way these cases do, with weight, with grief, with the machinery of justice grinding forward on behalf of someone who could not be in the courtroom to speak for himself. Joseph Bonito was initially charged with aggravated murder and child endangerment. The aggravated murder charge carried with it the possibility of the most severe penalties available under Ohio law. As the legal process progressed, a plea agreement was negotiated. Joseph Bonito agreed to plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter in connection with the death of Carson Bonito. In Ohio, voluntary manslaughter is defined as knowingly causing the death of another person under a sudden fit of passion or a sudden fit of rage brought on by serious provocation by the victim or another person. The charge acknowledges that a death occurred and that the person before the court was responsible for it, but frames the killing as something other than premeditated cold-blooded murder. To many, the distinction feels almost irrelevant when the victim is a 4-month-old infant who could not possibly have provoked anything. But this is how the legal system works. Plea agreements are negotiated for a range of reasons. Evidentiary strength, the interests of the family, the certainty of a conviction versus the risk of a trial. These are decisions made by prosecutors in consultation with investigators and sometimes with the wishes of the victim's family in mind. Joseph Bonito pleaded guilty. At sentencing, the judge imposed a prison term of 25 to 31 and a half years. 25 to 31 and a half years. Carson Bonito was 4 months old when he died. He will never have a birthday party, a first day of school, a graduation, a first love, a career, a life. All of that was taken from him before he had a chance to even know it was possible. Joseph Bonito will spend at minimum the next quarter century in an Ohio state prison. He will be eligible for a parole hearing in his 50s. Carson will never be any age at all. The sentence was handed down. The case was closed on paper. But the ripple effects of what happened in that house in Fostoria, Ohio do not close with a judge's gavel. They reach much further than that. The interrogation footage in this case is in many ways a textbook example of how a certain type of abuser responds under pressure. Understanding that response, understanding the psychology of what we see in that room, is not about excusing what happened. It is about understanding it, because understanding is the only tool we have to prevent it. Joseph Bonito came into that interrogation room with a prepared story, not necessarily a story he had spent days crafting. In many cases like this, the story forms almost automatically in the immediate aftermath of the act. The mind, confronted with the magnitude of what it has done, begins constructing a narrative of plausible deniability before the paramedics have even arrived. This is a psychological defense mechanism, not a sign of a calculating criminal genius, but a sign of a mind trying desperately to protect itself from the full weight of its own actions. The initial denial phase was consistent with this pattern. Joseph maintained his innocence calmly without visible agitation. This composure is often misread by lay observers as evidence of innocence. In reality, composure in an interrogation room can indicate the opposite. It can indicate that the person has had time to rehearse, that they have committed to a version of events and are prepared to defend it. The detectives did not mistake composure for innocence. They kept pushing. And what we observe in the behavioral shift as the physical evidence is introduced is psychologically revealing. Joseph's calm does not shatter, it adjusts. This is characteristic of people in his position. Rather than collapsing into admission when confronted with irrefutable medical evidence, he begins the process of reframing. The injuries become accidents. The force becomes exhaustion. The violence becomes a lapse. This reframing is not accidental. It is the mind's attempt to find the version of events that minimizes moral culpability while acknowledging enough of the truth to appear cooperative. It is a negotiation not with the detectives, but with reality. The mention of sleep deprivation and fatigue is particularly significant. Sleep deprivation is real. Its effects on judgment and impulse control are well documented, and it is frequently cited by defendants, by defense attorneys, by people trying to understand how a parent can harm their own child as a mitigating factor. The exhausted young father who snapped in a moment of desperation. But here is what the psychological record tells us about this framing. Sleep deprivation does not create violence where no violent impulse exists. It lowers inhibitions, it reduces self-control, it makes a person more likely to act on impulses they already have. What the healing rib fractures in Carson's body told investigators was that the harm done to this child was not a single isolated moment of snapping under pressure. It was a pattern. It happened more than once. It happened over a period of time. And after each occurrence, Joseph Bonito chose not to seek medical help for his son. That is not a moment of weakness. That is a series of choices. The admission of shaking, the most critical disclosure in this case, came embedded in a cloud of justification, framed as something that happened almost without awareness, as something he barely remembered, as something that could not possibly have caused what the doctors were describing. This diminishment of the act's severity is another consistent pattern in these cases. The mind refuses to connect the act to the consequence. It insists on a gap, a space between what was done and what resulted that does not actually exist. Carson's injuries were the direct result of what was done to him. There was no gap. Detectives who handle these cases learn to recognize all of these patterns. They learn to wait, to be patient, to let the person in the chair build and rebuild and modify their story until the scaffolding finally gives way. Because it always gives way. The truth is always heavier than the story built to contain it. And in that room in Fostoria, Ohio, the truth was very heavy indeed. Before we go any further, we need to stop. We need to step away from the interrogation footage and the forensic evidence and the legal proceedings. We need to step away from the timeline and the inconsistencies in the psychological analysis. Because in all of that, it is easy to lose sight of the person at the center of this story. Carson Bonito, 4 months old. He was not a case file. He was not a victim number. He was not a prop in a story about guilt and investigation and justice. He was a baby, a real living child who had a face and a smell and a laugh and a way of looking up at the people around him that made them want to be better than they were. 4 months old means waking up in the night and crying for warmth. It means tiny fingers that close around an adult's finger, automatically an ancient reflex that says, I am here, I need you, hold on. It means beginning to recognize voices, beginning to respond to the world, beginning just barely to be a person in it. Carson was beginning to be a person in the world. He had a mother who loved him, a mother who sat across from investigators and could not conceive of the possibility that the person she trusted most had done something unthinkable to her child. A mother who offered innocent explanations for things that were not innocent at all, not because she was lying, but because the truth was too far outside the boundaries of what she could allow herself to believe. Carson had a sibling, a 1-year-old child who would grow up without the little brother who was supposed to be beside them. Carson had a future, wholly imagined but completely real in the way that all futures are when a child is born. Every parent holds that future like a promise from the first moment they hold their child. First steps, first words, a lifetime of ordinary moments that build into a life. Carson never got those moments. He got 4 months, and in those 4 months in the home where he was supposed to be safest, he suffered in ways that no child should ever suffer. He endured injuries that healed quietly without anyone seeking help for him. He endured the consequence of being dependent on someone who could not be trusted. And then he was gone. There is no way to write about Carson Bonito without sitting with that for a moment, without acknowledging that what was lost when he died was irreplaceable, not a statistic, not a cautionary tale, a child, a human being with the full undimmed potential of any life barely begun. His name deserves to be said with that weight behind it. Carson Bonito, 4 months old, he mattered. He matters. He will always matter. Every case like this carries lessons. Not easy lessons, not comfortable ones, but lessons that if we are willing to sit with them, might make a difference the next time for some other child, somewhere in some other house where the people responsible for safety have begun to fail. The first lesson is about the danger of isolation. Carson's injuries were not new on the night the 911 call was made. The healing rib fractures proved that. He had been hurt before. He had been living with unaddressed injuries for weeks. And in all that time, nobody on the outside, no pediatrician, no family member, no neighbor, no teacher, no coach, no person in a position to observe and ask questions had intervened. Infants are isolated by nature. They cannot go to school. They cannot show up to a sporting event with bruises visible to a coach who has been trained to notice. They cannot tell a trusted adult that something is wrong at home. They are entirely dependent on the system of adults around them to maintain their safety, and when that system fails, or when those adults are themselves the source of the danger, infants have no recourse. This is the fundamental vulnerability of the very young, and it is why pediatric wellness visits matter. Not just as routine medical checkups, but as opportunities for trained medical professionals to observe a child's physical condition and ask questions. It is why healthcare providers receive training specifically designed to help them recognize the signs of non-accidental trauma in children. It is why reporting mechanisms exist and why they matter. The second lesson is about the warning signs that are easy to rationalize away. Carson's mother saw small bruises and offered an innocent explanation. She was not being dishonest. She genuinely believed her explanation. But unexplained or poorly explained bruising in an infant is a medical red flag. Not every bruise indicates abuse, but every unexplained bruise on an infant warrants a medical examination, not an accusation, not a confrontation, an examination. The gap between "that's probably nothing" and "let a doctor look at that" is very small. In Carson's case, crossing that gap might have changed everything. The third lesson is about what we ask of young parents and what support we fail to provide. This is not an excuse for what Joseph Bonito did. Nothing is. But the context in which infant abuse occurs is not random. It tends to cluster around youth financial stress, isolation, sleep deprivation, and the absence of adequate support systems, young parents struggling without help, without guidance, without anyone checking in. This does not explain violence. It identifies the conditions under which impulse control failures are more likely. And it suggests that investing in support for young struggling families, parenting resources, accessible mental health care community check-ins, is not just compassionate, it is preventive. The fourth lesson is about the medical and investigative community. In this case, the doctors and detectives did their jobs with precision and persistence. They did not accept the first explanation they were given. They looked at the evidence. They asked hard questions. They connected the dots between the old injuries and the new ones. They sat in that interrogation room for as long as it took. That persistence gave Carson's case a chance at justice. Not every case gets that. Not every jurisdiction has the resources, the training, or the institutional commitment to pursue these cases with the same rigor. That gap between what the best investigators do and what average resources allow is where some of these cases quietly close without accountability. Carson's case did not quietly close, but others do, and that is something worth sitting with. Joseph Bonito will be in his 50s before he is eligible for a parole hearing. He will have spent decades thinking about the night he made a 911 call and told dispatchers his son had stopped breathing, the detectives who sat across from him, the moment the medical evidence was laid out on the table in front of him, the moment his story stopped working. He will have decades to sit with what he did. Whether that time produces genuine accountability, genuine remorse, genuine understanding of what was taken, not from the legal system, not from society, but from a 4-month-old child who needed him, is something none of us can know. What we know is what was taken. 4 months is not a long life, but it is a life. It is a beginning, and beginnings matter. They are where everything comes from. Carson Bonito came into this world the way every child does, needing everything. Needing warmth and food and safety and love. Needing the adults around him to choose every single day to protect him, to be worthy of his total and complete trust. He did not get that. The question this case leaves us with is not simply about Joseph Bonito. It is not simply about one man's guilt or one family's tragedy. The question is bigger than that. How many other children are living right now in homes where something is wrong and nobody on the outside knows it? How many babies have bruises that are being explained away? How many parents are struggling in isolation with impulses they cannot control and resources they cannot access? We may never know the exact number, but we know the stakes. A child's life, a whole entire irreplaceable human life barely begun. The system that failed Carson, not the detectives, not the doctors who did everything right, but the broader system of support and observation and intervention that should have caught this sooner, that system still has gaps. Closing those gaps is not the work of one case or one investigation or one documentary. It is the work of communities, of pediatricians and teachers and neighbors and family members who are willing to ask the uncomfortable question when something does not look right. It is the work of all of us, for Carson, and for every child still waiting to be seen. If you have a concern about a child's safety, contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. You do not need proof. You only need a concern. Let the professionals determine what happens next. Make the call. One call can change everything.